All right. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Jeremy Grant. I serve as the coordinator of the Better Identity Coalition, and I'm really excited that all of you could join us today for the release of Better Identity in America, a blueprint for state policymakers, a publication that we just released moments ago. Just in terms of the agenda for today's event, I'm going to spend about a half an hour giving you an overview of the new policy blueprint. Then we're going to shift to a panel moderated by Ben Freed, the managing editor of State Scoop, with Tori Jessup from North Carolina's government, Angelique McClendon from the Georgia DMV, and Debbie Guild from PNC Financial Services Group to talk about some other government and industry perspectives on what we just released. Up front, let me just explain who this group is. The Better Identity Coalition. We were launched in February of 2018 as an initiative of a not-for-profit called the Center for Cybersecurity Policy and Law. And our focus is on bringing together leading companies from different sectors to develop and advance consensus-driven policy solutions that really can work across all sectors that promote better solutions for identity verification and authentication. And our members were an interesting group. I think there's a lot of industry-driven, or what I would call vendor-driven trade organizations that are often out there in this space. We're a little different in that this group was largely founded by the companies that I would say are the big buyers, the big consumers of digital identity. In many cases, the requirements they have are the same requirements that state governments also have when it comes to offering services. And a lot of our policy blueprint is focused on this idea of what is it that the government needs to do from a policy perspective, not just for the vendor industry, but for the country as a whole. So you can see we have leading companies from banking and payments, insurance, healthcare, telecom, technology, but also a lot of the vendors that are really important to providing solutions in this space. And so it's an interesting group of 27 companies that are all dedicated to advancing this mission of better policies in the identity and authentication space. In the summer of 2018, we published our inaugural policy blueprint, which laid out 5 core areas where government can and should help to make digital identity, as the name would suggest, better. With a specific action plan, it was really focused at the federal level. So it said, here's who needs to do what in both Congress and the executive branch. At the core of our original policy blueprint was the idea that there isn't any single action or initiative that can solve identity. But the idea was that if you take this blueprint as a package and advance it and fund it, it'll make things significantly better. And just in terms of the impact that we've had over the last 4 years, I think at a high level, it's really helped to change the discussion in Washington on digital identity, perhaps away from, some somewhat outdated or tired ideas like, oh, let's just solve everything with a national ID card, which is, from our perspective, I think both a political non-starter and also doesn't really actually solve the problems we have, and focusing instead on how we can come up with digital counterparts to a lot of the physical credentials that we have today. Much easier way to get some of the same outcomes. Among other things, the blueprint helped lead to the introduction of a bipartisan bill, the Improving Digital Identity Act, that's currently been marked up in both the House and Senate, and we'll see how things end up. I'm looking at my watch to see how many more days we have left in the calendar year as Congress is considering an omnibus bill. We're hopeful that that bill will be included to drive things forward. An important part of that original legislation that dealt with standards at NIST, providing guidance to federal, state, and local officials on digital identity and how they could stand up new services, was actually passed into law this summer as part of the landmark Chips and Science Act that was passed. And we have emerged as the one place where government across all levels comes to for ideas and collaborations on issues around digital identity. Today, we're really excited to be releasing a state-focused counterpart to the 2018 policy blueprint, laying out 6 different areas where we think state governors and state legislatures can act, along with a specific action plan that says what each step and each state should take. As with the original blueprint, we're not saying that there's a silver bullet. There's no single action that's going to solve things. But much as with our original blueprint, if you look at this as a package, it's going to help states really get ahead of some of the critical challenges in digital identity and improve things for everybody in their state and, indeed the country writ large. I just want to set the stage for a minute to talk about what does it mean when we say identity, because it's a term that's often, misused or conflated. And so this is going to be an oversimplification of things, but at a high level, there's really 2 things that, we're talking about with identity. The first is what we call identity proofing, which is really the process that somebody goes through at account opening. So if I show up and I say, to a bank or to a government agency, hey, I'm Jane Smith. Well, first they want to figure out, is there even a Jane Smith that really exists? Also knowing there might be 37,000 Jane Smiths in the US, a lot of people share names. Which of them are you? The second question is the question of identity resolution. We might leverage something like an identifier, like a social security number, to try and figure out, hey, it could be 37,000 people in my records. You must be this one. And then the third is really where we get to the core part of identity proofing, which is, okay, Jane, you tell me you're Jane, but how do I know you're not Jeremy, who's just got some information about you, who's trying to spoof you? And so how can you actually prove that somebody on the other end of a transaction who might just be on a smartphone or a computer is really that person? And then once we have identity proofing done at the account opening, we really get to the next set of issues, which is authentication, much more relevant after an account's been created and someone's logging back in, trying to answer a bit of a simpler question, which is, are you the same person who's previously issued a credential? This is what we usually talk about as the password problem. And in terms of framing the challenge, this is a cartoon we often share. It's the most repeated or replicated cartoon from the New Yorker magazine of all time. And it really, helps to capture, I think, some of the challenges we're still dealing with today. But something people don't realize, this cartoon was published in 1993. It's 29 years old, which means these dogs are now a blessed memory because of dog years, and their kids probably are too. But the problem's actually with us more than ever today. In fact, I go back to 1993. I was finishing up my freshman year in college. I was doing email and on some online bulletin board systems back at Michigan. You'd run into, dogs on the internet, somebody, pretending to be somebody else, but it was generally kind of funny or good natured. There wasn't a whole lot of things that were sinister about it. Whereas today we're seeing dogs on the internet are being actively weaponized against us. And as we'll get into some of the statistics, it's an anomaly when a big breach happens and identity is not the attack vector. And we're seeing tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions of dollars in identity fraud each year that's victimizing dozens of government agencies and companies and millions of Americans each year. But solving this problem isn't just really about security. In fact, the security can be the easy part. It's balancing it with experiences that also can protect privacy, that can deliver an excellent customer experience, that helps agencies and companies comply with standards and regulations and laws, that can do this in a way that makes transaction costs more manageable. So much of the challenge here really comes down to how do we build identity systems that we can trust? And trust, as most folks understand, has been really hard to get right on the internet. But identity, when done right, enables trust. Identity becomes what we call the great enabler, providing a foundation for digital transactions and online experiences that are more secure, that are easier to use, and that can protect privacy better than the legacy tools we have today. The challenge, the reason we've been dealing with this problem for 29 plus years, as the folks at NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, laid out, is that this process of digital identity often involves proofing people over an open network. And when it gets to authentication, you're always always authenticating subjects over an open network. And all the processes and technologies that we use to establish and use digital identities offer a lot of opportunities for bad guys to impersonate people or launch other attacks. Part of the reason we see so many attacks is our approach to date in this space hasn't exactly been overly sophisticated. Though for those of you who might have acquired a pandemic puppy over the last couple of years, that name you chose probably has some new meaning for you and your children. And this focus on security questions, it also hasn't been the most practical in terms of sometimes with security questions, you might forget your answer, or you might change your mind, or you're not sure, and you say, wait, green, no blue, and then you're thrown off into the gorge of eternal peril, also known as the account recovery process that most online service providers trigger you to shift over to when you no longer know the answers to your security questions. And this idea that we're going to have shared secrets, that I know something and the service provider knows something, well, it hasn't really worked particularly well when we're basing these questions around things where our adversaries already know the answer. One thing we'll talk about today is Social Security numbers aren't really secure these days. And so we shouldn't be building security factors based on something like the assumption that knowledge of an SSN or some part of it proves that you must be that person. In fact, a lot of people might know it these days. And sadly, while this has been a problem over the last 15, 20 years, the last few years, everything got much worse. Identity scams, we saw a record year in 2021. This next slide is from a deck that was prepared by a group called the Pandemic Relief Accountability Council, which is at the federal government. It's the council of the inspector generals in different agencies who've been tracking all of the fraud that happened during the pandemic. They noted in public benefits programs, the FTC in 2020 saw an increase of nearly 3,000% in terms of the complaints they got tied to identity theft of public benefits. And, outside of just beyond government, we're now seeing nearly half of Americans have been a victim of identity theft at some point. And I think a big takeaway today is while this has been a problem for many years and the numbers have been growing gradually, we really saw things hockey stick the last 4 years to the point where the number of people who are being impacted and the number of dollars that are being lost and the crimes that are being perpetrated have reached a point where we don't think policymakers can ignore this anymore. They need to take more action. And this goes well beyond government programs. It hits banking, it hits health, retail, and other sectors. The picture here is from a gentleman named Jimmy Kirby, who's the deputy director of FinCEN, the Treasury Department's Financial Crime Enforcement Network, from a speech he gave back in September, where he said, as we look at the more than 3 million suspicious activity reports that banks file with us, where they think there's an evidence of financial crime, the vast majority include reference to some sort of potential breakdown in the ID verification process. And this kind of aligns with the numbers we've seen. The Javelin study that comes out every year from Javelin Research showed $56 billion was stolen from identity fraud in 2020. That's a number that's up 333% from 2017. The ITRC, the ID Theft Research Center, says 293 million people were impacted by data breaches last year, and the number of breaches grew 23%. The Federal Reserve has said that synthetic identity fraud is the fastest growing type of financial crime in America, $20 billion lost to it in 2020. The majority of breaches in the cybersecurity world exploit identity as an attack vector, often using weak or stolen passwords to access systems and steal data. And I mentioned the FTC stats before. So I've been talking for a while about the problem. I want to pivot to why has this been so hard to solve? And this starts to get into some of the meat of what's in our new policy blueprint. A big theme that we talk about in there is what we call the identity gap, which is that the US has a number of nationally recognized authoritative identity systems, the driver's license, the birth certificate, the passport, the social security card. Authoritative systems are split between the federal, state, and local level, and all of the ones we have are largely trapped in the paper world, whereas the transactions we're trying to engage in today are increasingly online. And we haven't really had government ever sort of recognize that gap as it's been emerging and take steps to address it. So if you've ever been trying to either access a government service online or perhaps apply for a credit card and you got a question like this, well, this was an attempt to get around the identity gap. It's what people call knowledge-based verification. And it's, taken its fare of shots over the last few years, in part because we've seen attackers catch up with it. But one thing I'll point out is this was a response from industry that they created when government never took any steps on its own side to address the identity gap between the physical documents that we use in one domain and the digital space where we needed credentials. Industry wanted to bring digital commerce online. These kinds of tools were the best solution out there. And as I noted, it worked for a while, but the attackers have caught up today. This idea that there's questions that are out of wallet, meaning if I found your wallet on the street, I wouldn't know the answer to, well, maybe there was a time that they were secret, but the news clips here are from 2015 when the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, launched an app called Get Transcript that allowed people to sign up to get their tax transcript online. They were protecting it with knowledge-based verification, and about 750,000 Americans had their transcripts stolen because, as you can see circled at the bottom of that screen, the hackers already had the keys. The answers to these so-called secret questions are now widely known. So why is that happening? Well, there was a hearing in 2017 at the House Energy and Commerce Committee here in Washington, where they really focused on this topic of identity verification in the post-breach world. And there was something that the chairman of that committee at the time, Greg Walden, said, is he says, we look at a lot of breaches and they're all on their own a serious policy issue. What we're now seeing is the potential for malicious actors to combine multiple stolen data sets from different breaches into one, which then enables them to obtain more complete packages of identity information that they can use to go perpetrate the next attack. And you can certainly see this chart on the right is from a site called Information is Beautiful that tracks major breaches running from 2014 at the bottom to now at the top. And both the size of breaches and the volume of breaches has really been expanding quite a bit. And one of the goals, more pieces of personal data that you can then use to essentially trick these knowledge-based systems into thinking that you're somebody who you're not. So to summarize where we're at today, in an era where our transactions are increasingly digital, our authoritative identity systems are stuck in the paper world. Solutions like knowledge-based verification that papered over that fact helped for a while, but the attackers have caught up. Anything in the security world online that's based on a shared secret, like an SSN or a password, those things are sadly no longer secret and don't really have security value. I don't want to say everything's bleak. There's some great industry innovation helping to better some next generation tools. We're really on the cusp of passwordless authentication right now, where we'll eliminate the knowledge factor entirely. There's some great ID proofing tools that can scan and validate ID documents, have somebody hold up their smartphone and validate it with a selfie. But at the end of the day, government is the only authoritative issuer of identity. And so we believe in this next phase of making identity better, the government's also going to have a role to play. So, to summarize it, with some really sophisticated PowerPoint graphics, if there's one message that you should take away today, it's that this coalition, our 27 industry members, are saying that collectively, we cannot solve identity alone. If we're going to really solve this problem, we're going to need better access to the authoritative government sources that are the issuers of identity in the first place. And then, of course, the challenge there is, since there's a lot of ways we could do that really terribly for security and privacy, how do we actually flip those concerns on their head and architect this in a way that's great for security and privacy? And so this will get us to our policy blueprint. So the blueprint we released today has 6 key initiatives. I'm going to dive through each of them in the coming slides. We need to place the DMV at the center of state digital identity solutions. We think we also need to look at state vital records bureaus, who play a really key role, and have them establish identity and attribute validation services in the digital space. We think states need to be looking at ways they can embrace identity innovation for better services. We also want to talk about making sure identity works for everybody. It doesn't today, and in the digital world, some of those inequities could only be exacerbated. We think states need to promote and prioritize the use of strong authentication. And finally, when crafting policies around identity, take the time to talk to experts, make sure that you're not going to inadvertently do any harm. So let me start with the DMV. Why are we focusing so heavily on there? Why are they number one in the blueprint? Well, the DMV in most states is the one government entity where pretty much every adult is going to go through some sort of a robust in-person identity verification process with a government agent. DMVs also provide the most commonly used ID documents in the US. 89% of adults have a driver's license, and a lot of those who don't will go to the DMV to get a non-driver's ID card from the state. So there's a real opportunity for states as they're thinking about how do they go solve digital identity, which is, rather than go create some new identity system, how can you leverage the ones that you have tied to the authoritative sources and just create digital counterparts to the physical credentials that they issue today? So a core idea that we talked about both in our original policy blueprint and in the state one as well is, if I've already gone through the process of having an agency like the DMV vet my identity once, I don't really like going through that process, by the way. It requires, some other things that might be unpleasant. But I had to go through it. It's fine. When I need to prove who I am online to another party, can I just ask that agency to vouch for me, rather than have to try to repeat the equivalent of that process online? And so one of the things we are calling for is that our legacy paper-based systems ought to be modernized around a privacy-protecting, consumer-centric model that would allow any consumer to ask an agency that issued a credential to stand behind it in the online world by validating the information from that credential. And so here we think DMVs should look to accelerate work that some are starting to do, but not really yet on a nationwide basis, around mobile driver's license apps, MDLs, and other digital identity services that create that digital counterpart to the plastic cards they issue today. And with this, we think it's really important that states prioritize the digital use cases for what we call remote identity proofing. We're seeing some states move forward with some things that are kind of interesting in terms of where you could use your smartphone instead of a plastic card in person, say to go through airport security to TSA or to get into a bar. And those are things that we think are kind of nice to have. But given the massive problems we have with, billions and billions of dollars of fraud and millions of Americans tied to the remote identity proofing use cases, those really should be the priority. And, just to get people thinking about this, knowing the problem so many states had with COVID unemployment benefits distribution, imagine what that could have looked like if there was a solution that most of the residents in your state who were filing for UI had that was tied to their smartphone, that was, proof of their identity. Could have been an entirely different story if we had this kind of digital identity infrastructure in place. So I often get asked, well, okay, MDLs, how would this actually work? So let's just take a hypothetical dealing with somebody who we'll call Stacy, which happens to be my wife's name. And she's applying to a bank. We've got Debbie here as one of our panelists, so we'll say PNC for a credit card. And she passes over her basic information online, and the bank says, okay, this is information a lot of people could have. How do I know it's actually you? So here, she's going to say, I want the government to actually help me prove I'm me. Hey, government agency who already did this once, can you help me out? So, we talked about she's already been to the DMV. She's gotten her driver's license through an in-person process. Now she has a mobile driver's license app on her phone that's cryptographically signed by the DMV. She can then basically pass that digitally signed information on to the bank, and then the bank simply has to validate the digital signature that was used. If the DMV can say it's a valid key, well, now the bank suddenly has a pretty good level of confidence that this really is Stacy who's on the other end of the transaction, and not somebody who just stole some of her data and is trying to spoof her identity. So there's some real benefits here with the digital use cases around mobile driver's license. They're more secure, as we just talked about. They're also privacy protecting in that you hand over your physical ID or take a picture of it and submit it. All the data elements, including height and weight, and whether you're an organ donor and some things that might not be relevant to a transaction are shared. Whereas with a mobile driver's license, you can choose to share only those specific elements that are needed for a transaction. And also the way it's architected, while the states validate the digital signature, there's no reason for them to track how the ID is being used. In fact, they shouldn't have to know at all. It's also a lot easier to use compared to some other processes that are out there. Saves time, delights customers. We think beyond the MDL, states also have some work to do in terms of complementing these apps with what we're calling attribute validation services, essentially having a consumer be able to just ask the DMV to tell somebody like a bank or a health firm or any place they're trying to prove who they are, if they're submitting data, can they, the state provide a yes/no answer as to whether the data that was submitted matches what an agency has on file when they're trying to prove their identity. Now, AMVA, the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators, has set up a service a few years ago called DLDV, the Driver's License Data Validation Service. One of the challenges that a lot of states don't fully participate in, and it really limits the utility of the service. And so, one of the things we're calling for states to fully do so that if, a company that is operating nationwide wants to validate driver's license data, they know that no matter what state the driver's license come from, they can go back and actually get a yes/no answer in terms of whether the information matches. And the nice thing about this from a privacy and security perspective is states aren't revealing any personal information. There's not really privacy or security risk because it's just a yes/no answer. The yes, this matches our records, or no, it doesn't. That doesn't prove that somebody is who they are, but it still can help to take a lot of the risk out of, say, synthetic identity fraud and other challenges we see in the space. With this, we think we need to go beyond the DMVs to vital records bureaus. Birth certificates are the original foundational identity document for most people in the country. Marriage and death date is also relevant, but much as with driver's licenses, most vital records bureaus are stuck in the paper world. And here again, there is a system, EVE, the Electronic Verification of Vital Events system that's run by the good folks at NAFSIS, that will validate that data with a yes/no answer. But access is largely limited only to government agencies, and non-governmental entities in the private sector can't use it to speed remote identity verification or for fraud prevention purposes. The third thing we talk about in the blueprint is embracing identity innovation for better services. And there's a couple key items here. One, look, if it's not obvious from this presentation, we're really bullish about mobile driver's licenses. And we think that when it comes to all of the things states can do, dollar for dollar, pound for pound, they're going to get, the most bang for their buck there in terms of how they're going to be able to help both, people in their states as well as businesses in their states and their own state agencies. But to roll out MDLs, it's going to take time. And there's going to be some people who might not want to have one, or they might not have the technology like a smartphone needed to support it. A lot of people still don't have smartphones in this country. And so we're going to need to have other alternatives to sort of round out this core solution and, meet people where they're at. So on the state side, we think states, for their services can complement some of the DMV-centric solutions with commercial identity solutions that have been certified as meeting the guidelines for digital identity that are defined by NIST. Identity Assurance Level 2 is really sort of the mid-level of, from a risk perspective, where a lot of applications need to be. We also want to see states embrace the innovations of remote online notarization, where notarization for years has been an in-person process, but we've now seen 41 states pass these remote online notarization laws, which allows notaries to use a technology platform to do a notarization process over a digital channel. And, it's very robust, relative to, I think, what you might see in other digital channels. There's an audio and video recording of every signing session. You can go back. There's a full audit trail, a lot of other security controls there. But not every state has embraced this. We think it's time that, states look to leverage digital identity innovation here to enable these types of services. A fourth thing we want to talk about is how do we make sure identity works for everybody? And I think something we spend a good deal of time in the new blueprint talking about is that today it doesn't. Thousands, probably millions of Americans today can't get traditional physical government IDs because they don't have the documents to prove who they are, and they don't have the resources to get them. And this is disproportionately impacting a lot of the most marginalized communities across the country. So, the article on the right that's highlighted was from the Washington Post magazine about 5 years ago, and it highlighted the catch-22 of what does it mean to be poor and have no ID? If you don't have an ID and you try to go get one, well, they want money to get one, and you can't get the money unless you have a job, and you can't get a job unless you have an ID. And it's really this vicious circle where a lot of people who are, in many cases, dealing with some of the hardest situations. Let's say you were evicted and your driver's license or maybe you don't even have a driver's license. Maybe it's just your social security card and birth certificate washed away in the rain with the rest of the belongings left on the street. Or you're fleeing a domestic violence situation and just leave with the clothes on your back, you have no ID. A lot of people really get stuck in places where they have no place to go afterwards. And in too many cases in government agencies, the standard response if people don't have the documentation they need to get an ID is, well, come back when you get it. One of the things that we're urging states to do is look for ways to shift that, to also ask the question of, hey, if you don't have that, do you need assistance in actually getting those documents? Do you have the resources that you need to actually go get them? This is a way to try and get people out of this catch-22 trap and actually, build systems that work for everybody. Also, to this point, we think when we're designing new physical or digital identity systems, it's important to consider ways that they're accessible to everybody, no matter your age, income, or ability. We did a policy forum last January where a gentleman named Chris Peterson with a group named Penny Forward, he happens to be a software developer who's blind, and he was talking about if you are asking people to take a picture of a state ID, hold up their phone and take a selfie, you need adaptive technology to work, to help somebody like him sort of position everything in the right place. Otherwise, these apps aren't going to work for him. So making things work for everybody is really quite important. Two final items. One, promoting and prioritizing the use of strong authentication. So we talked earlier about how compromised passwords are at the root of most cybersecurity incidences in the US, and the numbers haven't exactly been good the last couple of years. So for years, we've been urging people to adopt multi-factor authentication to stop these attacks. One of the challenges we're seeing there is that some of the legacy forms of MFA are also vulnerable to phishing attacks. If you're using a one-time passcode, well, if you can be tricked through a phishing attack into handing over a password, that one-time passcode, people can be tricked into handing over as well. In fact, we're seeing bots automate it. Same with some of the tools that use push notifications to click, yes, it's me trying to log in. Those are also starting to be compromised. And so one trend that we're seeing, in fact, this was highlighted by both the White House as well as CISA at the federal level this last year, is the need to embrace some newer standards around authentication that are actually phishing resistant. And so here we talk about the work that a standards group called the FIDO Alliance has done. CISA has called FIDO the gold standard of MFA because it can stand up to these phishing attacks. And you can actually deploy it in a way that's truly passwordless, so it's both more secure and has a better user experience. So for states, prioritizing MFA and preferably phishing resistant MFA should be a priority. With this, we also see MFA often complemented by what's known as risk-based authentication tools that will analyze data about a device or how it's being used to detect security incidents and protect against fraud and cybercrime. And here, one of the concerns we've seen in some states as they're considering new privacy laws is there's a real difference when you're putting restrictions on how data should be used between data that's going to be used for marketing, where some restrictions are probably going to apply, but we want to make sure we don't put restrictions in place on use of data for security and fraud prevention. Now, to be clear, we never want to see the streams cross. We should not be collecting data for the purposes of security, and then suddenly it shows up in another part of the company. But it's important to create carve-outs so that we're not inadvertently precluding the use of some of these risk-based tools. GDPR in Europe has a carve-out for them. CCPA in California did one as well. We think other states should embrace similar language as they're considering privacy language. And that brings us to our last point, which is do no harm. So, we've talked about earlier in this presentation how when we get things right, identity can be the great enabler. But there's a lot of ways we can implement these systems poorly, in a way that's creating new challenges. It could erode privacy and civil liberties. You might be creating user experience that actually make things harder for people online or exacerbating existing inequities. So a few recommendations that we give to states here. One, when you're looking to actually craft policies, take the time to consult with security and identity experts to make sure that you're not inadvertently creating some new mandate for something that might put people more at risk than the problem you're trying to solve. And with this, we think, we've seen some states try to come up with their own, what I would call sort of proprietary roll your own approaches to standards, or an approach to identity proofing, or an approach to authentication that, in many cases conflict with what we see either with NIST standards in the US, or in some cases, some of the ISO standards, like what we've seen with mobile driver's licenses emerge. So our point to states is look first to what's out there. There's actually a lot of good work that's been done that can be reused, and it's often updated as threats evolve. And only seek to craft your own guidelines or standards if you've somehow come to the conclusion that whatever's out there isn't going to meet your needs. But don't, take the approach of we should create our own approach before we should look to what is already out there and what's proven. And with that, we urge states to avoid blanket bans on use of different identity technologies. There's a lot of controversy around things like biometrics or artificial intelligence, and By no means are we trying to downplay any of those. I think there's, some real concerns and risks that states should be considering. But the flip side is when we see blanket bans across the board, our concern is that, policies really ought to be targeted around where is there a specific risk or harm with the technology or application? And then how do you come up with some targeted policies that might limit or put some guidelines or rules around the use of those technologies, rather than blanket bans across the board that might actually stand in the way of getting some of the outcomes on security and privacy and inclusion that you're looking for. So with that, in the interest of time, I won't read these 6 again. I think I've walked you through pretty well with them. But before we get to our panel, the point I wanted to leave you with is, please feel free to reach out to the coalition as your states are contemplating policies on this front. We're here to help. Our members are here to help, and we'd welcome the chance to provide more input and explore what you're looking to do and see where we can collaborate. So with that, I'm now going to hand things over to our panel. I'll be clicking off, and Ben, Tori, Angelique, and Debbie, if all of you can come on, and we'll move on with the panel session of the show. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Jeremy. I'm Benjamin Freed. I'm the managing editor of State Scoop, where we cover state government tech issues, including identity and access management. Our panel today is Tori Jessup, the Chief Operating Officer of the North Carolina Department of Information Technology, Angelique McClendon, she's the General Counsel at the Georgia Department of Driver Services, and Debbie Guild, the Chief Security Officer at PNC. And Angelique, I actually want to start with you because something that Jeremy stressed in his presentation is that under the blueprint that the Better Identity that the Better Identity Coalition put out today is that the DMV or whatever it's called in there, from state to state, should be at the center of identity programs. So what's some of the progress that Georgia's made in its digital identity programs, and where do you see the work going in the future?
Okay, thank you. So in addition to being general counsel for the Georgia Department of Driver Services, I'm also very active with AMVA, and Jeremy mentioned AMVA, which is the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators. And as part of that work with AMVA, I'm on several committees. One in particular is the Mobile Driver's License Committee. And, one of the things that Georgia, of course, is headed toward is the mobile driver's license. And our plans are to launch a pilot probably at first quarter of next year. So that's pretty soon. But, as far as the state being at the center of the DMV being at the state of digital identity solutions in the state of Georgia, I just think it's a natural progression, right? So, we talk about MDL and how do we get there, but it's because we collect all that information. So, you start off as years and decades ago, just the DMV or driver services, we've been called driver services since 2005, but if you go back to 1940s, it wasn't even a state thing, right? If you go back to the 50s and 40s, it was, a county or a city would issue a driver's license, right? And they just want to know whether or not you can drive. No picture on that, it's just a document, right? And then decades later, there came a need to know exactly a little bit about, maybe we need to know who should be driving this. This isn't Mr. Johnny, this is really Mr. Johnny's son driving. So maybe we need a picture on there, right? And so about in Georgia, at least around 1960s, you add a picture. And then after that, maybe 1970s, late 60s, you add Social Security. Even having that Social Security number being used as the driver's license number, right? Of course, that didn't turn out so well. So around the 90s, that was legislated to stop. So probably a little bit before then, that practice of using that Social Security number as the driver's license number had ceased, but it was legislated in the 1990s in Georgia. And so you go from driving ability to starting to want to know who this person is, to realizing you're collecting all this information. And then in the 1990s, you also have the passage of the Driver's License Privacy Protection Act as well. And so then it starts to go to how can we protect the data that we obtain. And then, of course, we know 9/11 happened, and out of 9/11 grew Real ID. And so that's when state DMV started to concentrate on proving you are who you say you are. So not that I just say I'm Angelique McClendon. My family calls me Angel. So what if I want to go in and say, hey, my name's Angel McClendon. I like Angel McClendon better. Angelique and McClendon all together, too many letters, right? And so, but we really want to make sure that we know that you are who you say you are. And a colleague of mine mentioned and talked about identity. Yes, that's who you are. But the government is formalizing it. So the process that we are going through here is not saying you can't be called Angel, just not on that driver's license, right? We have a lot of people who want to use nicknames or just this is what I've always been called. And we have to explain to them, no, this is the process. And I like one thing that Jeremy mentioned. I liked a lot of things that was mentioned, but one thing in particular was the focus on making sure identity works for everyone. And when you have people who come in and say, I've always been known as this, but this isn't on my birth certificate, but this is what I've used officially on military documents, school documents for decades. What does that person do when their birth certificate says their name is something else? A lot of what we get are unofficial adoptions. We get those, especially for people who maybe are older, maybe your parents on your birth certificate, or one of your parents, and particularly, I'll use an example that we get quite often is stepfather has raised a person, and that person was born with a different last name. And that stepfather comes in the picture very early, raises that child, and that person uses that name on all of their documents from age 5, for instance, until 60 something. And what we do for a person like that, a person who doesn't have the documents, maybe you don't know your birth certificate, where your birth certificate is, or you can't obtain it, or there's some other process you need to go to, like an amended birth certificate or seeking a passport. We have what we call a secure ID help desk to help those people. So that's one of the solutions that we have had in place since we became Real ID compliant in 2012. And so that is a solution that's been very helpful. It's proven. We've gone from probably, I say, having to help hundreds of people a year with that process to that process maybe decreasing with the need for it not being there since we've been Real ID compliant for so long. What we see now are not a lot of renewals that need help with Real ID compliance, but a lot of people who are new to Georgia, and maybe they're coming from a state that wasn't Real ID compliant. That's probably a large percentage of those cases in the Secure ID help desk. So we're working with those people to make sure we can get them that amended birth certificate. We can help them get that passport. We can help them find that marriage license that they need to prove that last name. And so the people out of that who can't obtain that document that way with that assistance, we actually send them to our board to go through what we call a waiver process. So we say, okay, this person doesn't have a birth certificate or a passport, can't afford a passport, doesn't have a birth certificate, but with that birth certificate that they have and those school documents, military documents, Social Security documents, with the totality of the documents that we have for this person, we will take that case to our board, and they are successful with obtaining that document. So one thing we're pretty confident in Georgia, unless there was some sophisticated fraud happening, that if a person has a document that says that has the state of Georgia on it, and it was issued by the state of Georgia, that we are confident that at the time we issued that, we are confident that that person is who they say they are. So we believe in a robust verification system, but we know that makes it difficult for some people. And so we assist in helping people with obtaining those documents.
I want to make sure everybody gets a chance to chime in, but obviously, but it sounds, from what you just said, the history of driver's licenses and government issued identities is obviously a journey in which more and more information has been included. And it sounds like there are a number of ways to achieve that goal of making it work for everybody. But as we're talking about digital ID and whether it's driver's licenses or other ways to access, to use a digital document to access services, there's a big balance of security and privacy and making sure that the user experience is as smooth as possible. I want to go to Tori in North Carolina. What's some of the work that you've done on that front in making making that experience easier for North Carolinians?
Well, thanks for the question, and glad to be a part of the panel today. I'm a longtime fan of the Digital Identity Coalition. That first blueprint I kept on my desk when I was the DMV commissioner, and often referenced it. So kudos to the team for launching yet another blueprint for state policymakers. Some of the things that we're doing in the state of North Carolina. Well, first of all, I'd like to say, I do believe that DMV should be that center. I'm a little biased because I'm a former commissioner of DMV, but now I'm on another side of this whole process and working as the chief operating officer for the Department of Information Technology now for almost a year, just up under a year. I'm seeing that there's more to the digital identity conversation than just the attributes that are offered by the driver's license. As a resident of North Carolina for my entire life, you can imagine the amount of data that the state has on me or for me. And we have a whole data division that manages all of that. And so while those attributes are important and good because that infrastructure that DMVs provide the highest level of authentication or verification for identities, because it is at least one time that you have to go into that office, or that many people, 80% of our population goes into that office in person and provides, tangible documents in person at least one time. And so that's important infrastructure that cannot be ignored. So in the state of North Carolina, of course, that's something that we plan to utilize. So in North Carolina, we're starting to use more multi-factor authentication, starting within our organization, with state employees. We are improving the way that citizens or residents, the public, access government services. And I say the public intentionally and not citizens, because we have a pretty robust university system in North Carolina. And so we have out-of-state students that also have some identity attributes that may be used for services online at some point while they're here in the state. And tomorrow, we're kicking off a work group. We established a charter with the Department of Information Technology, DMV, and the governor's office to have a broad conversation around digital identity. And we plan to map out our journey as a state to mature our digital identity. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that, about a year ago, Secretary Jim Weaver, who is a rather new secretary here for the Department of Information Technology, hired the state's first chief privacy officer, Cherie Givens, who's a thought leader in this regard as well. And so we're maturing our privacy office to make sure that we're managing the data that people provide to us, and we have good policies around that.
Yeah, I want to give Debbie a chance to jump in here as well. Debbie, from where you are in the banking industry, that's become a primarily, certainly for me, and I think a lot of people I know, it's become primarily digital experience. It's the times that I've needed to walk actually walk into a bank lobby are few and far between, because most of my interactions with my financial institutions are online. Since that's become the norm in your industry, how do you make sure, like, you achieve everything that we saw in Jeremy's presentation, making sure everybody is who they say they are, and but also making sure that it's not a frustrating experience on the user end.
Yeah, you're spot on, Ben. We spend a lot of time balancing what we call sort of that customer friction with the strength of our authentication. And Jeremy's cartoon lives rent free in my brain forever, because at the other end is, I wish it were dogs, and we have fraudsters, we have nation states, we have all manner of things at the other end of the wire. But Debbie Guild, I run enterprise technology and security, fraud, cyber, and physical security are under my remit. We've been working on this journey in concert with the Better Identity Coalition with Jeremy since 2018. But I wanted to talk a little bit about that symbiotic relationship that we use in banking around the two A's, right? First, authentication, who are you? And then authorization, now what are you permitted to do? And there's a huge symbiotic relationship between the two. And if authentication fails, authorization just goes off the rails. So, it's super important in terms of having confidence for who or what is at the other end of the wire. Once we have that confidence in your identity, then we're able to say, how much money do you have access to, whether that's deposits or loans? How much money are you allowed to move? How often can you move it? Is it normal? Can we increase limits? What does the volume and velocity look like? When we have that confidence, we can dynamically open and close what we call sort of the aperture on authorization. And everybody, should care about that for all the right reasons. We have to get that right. If we have too little friction, if you will, there's fraud. If we have too much, people call into the care center and then can't get access to their data or their money. That's a bad day. If it's not inclusive, people are locked out or even not able to gain access to the banking ecosystem, which is really important when they're trying to do things like receive fiscal policy money, when we're trying to distribute that quickly. So I spend a lot of my time trying to be Goldilocks, just find that right sweet spot right in the middle. And it's a journey, and I'm really proud to be part of that. We first came together with Jeremy in 2018, coming out of the Equifax breach, where we really wanted to make sure that we eliminated these vast honeypots of data that can be used for mass attacks, reduce the dependency on the social security number as an authenticator, make multi-factor authentication easier, et cetera. And our initial focus, as Jeremy articulated, was to really kind of put that out there as at a national level. And that's culminated, as Jeremy stated, in the Improving the Digital Identity Act. And we're really proud of that work, but it's only possible. It's only possible to do that with the state's involvement, period, amen. This is where the rubber meets the road on everything that we've outlined. So that's why I'm here today, is to really just make sure that each state and every state recognizes their vital importance in this journey. I recall when I first started out on Better Identity Coalition, I kind of walked in there like Pollyanna, and I was like, oh, why can't we just have a national ID, Jeremy? He quickly educated me on a number of factors, not the least of which, I was like, well, this, so-and-so country has a national ID. And, after he, educated me on some of the other components of lack of, democracy in some of those countries, he also said, look, that's also, that country, Debbie, is a side of Rhode Island. So our ability to do this and to do it meaningfully it rests within our state ecosystem, our powerful state ecosystem. And what I love about what we're doing here is we've created this national framework. So we're basically not coming to the states and just sort of shouting across the wire and say, hey, do it better. You've just heard of that evolution from Angelique in terms of what they've done over the course of decades in Georgia. These 6 very thoroughly vetted pathways are huge, and it's really the secret decoder ring. And I would encourage everybody who's on this call to really spend some time understanding the 6 elements of the state blueprint. That state-run DMV, it's the cornerstone. That in-person experience, making sure that identity is vetted in detail, I'm vitally dependent on that to determine who to bank, and then who can move money. The other thing that I would say is it is sort of time for another evolution. And again, this blueprint helps define what that means. So things like leveraging vital records remotely to be able to validate foundational information, embracing new technologies to scale digitally, such as that remote online notarization that Jeremy mentioned earlier, ensuring that identity can work for everyone. Jeremy showed a picture of a church in DC that really helps as a ministry help make sure that people have access to gaining back their identity. And I had the privilege of sitting down in that ecosystem for a day not too long ago. And I tell you, it's truly God's work. And when you sit down with the gentleman who runs it, I'll refer to him as Pastor Ben. He views identity as a basic human right. He's like, Debbie, there's food, there's water, there's clothing, there's shelter, and there's identity. It's in that sentence. You can't. The fact that identity is critical to receiving, to getting shelter, to receiving healthcare, to almost everything in our modern world, that defines us as a great country. Identity is again that cornerstone. I loved hearing about Georgia's Secure ID Help Desk. What we want is for every state to have sort of that concierge experience where if there's a sort of a challenge with somebody gaining access to their identity, help them out. That's a real vulnerable moment for people on a number of fronts. And it helps make sure that I can legitimately bank people who want access to the banking rails for legitimate reasons, not mule accounts or otherwise. Use strong authentication. Passwords are dead. Get mad, get angry, get over it. Immerse your state practitioners in understanding multi-factor authentication. Fast identity online is also just a huge resource for people. Make security a birthright. It doesn't have to necessarily be harder. We talk about friction. We really want to make sure that it's sort of risk adjusted, where you have to, not necessarily make it a harder experience. You don't have to create vast honeypots of data. I don't store any biometric data about our customers. I don't want to have to protect it, but my customers get to store their biometric, sovereignty of their data in their own sort of virtual wallet. We make that a huge cornerstone of our program. And, Jeremy mentioned do no harm. There's going to be a ton of questions. Phone a friend, leverage NIST. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater on things like biometrics. There are smart ways to implement them that help make sure that there are safeguards. But know that what you're doing, I mentioned this is sort of, it's if you define the American dream as democracy, rights, liberty, opportunity, and equality, it's usually only possible with a bank account, access to credit, ability to pay for and receive goods. The key to that, it's identity, and that's why I'm here today. So back to you, Ben.
Okay, and thank you. I would say that the Pastor Ben you talked about is absolutely not me, but sounds much better than me. But you talk about we talked a lot about doing no harm, and I think I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk at least a little bit about the problems that we've seen, especially in the past couple of years, with identity fraud, especially on a large scale, with the pandemic relief programs. I unfortunately I think we got to keep it kind of lightning round at this point, but I would like to hear everybody's thoughts on just on what steps can be done to make sure that what happened with so many of the pandemic relief programs that were in many cases filtered through the private banks. What can be done to make sure that doesn't happen in the future? Debbie, I'll start with you since you're since it's your industry, and then we'll hear from Tori and Angelique.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you do have to make sure that people are sort of qualified to access the rails. I will tell you the vast amount of fraud wasn't necessarily with the private banks. There was a lot of challenges with respect to multi-factor authentication in some of the different on-ramps, if you will. Some places that were making it incredibly easy, which is great, until the threat actors figure out that you need two pieces of information to gain access to those dollars. So it does come back to this not notion, but this capability relative to strong authentication. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be incredibly difficult. So coming back to multi-factor authentication, if you applied at any of the state levels for any of the unemployment insurance, it was very, for I would say good reason. There was a number of controls that were lifted because we wanted to, as a country, get money into people's hands faster. And as a result of lifting those controls, there was a natural knock-on effect of vast amounts of fraud that came with that. So when you went out to any state and applied, you really needed two pieces of, as Jeremy describes it, knowledge-based information to gain access to those dollars. There is no sort of multi-factor in those processes at all.
Angela, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that we're even discussing in Georgia is just more collaboration with state agencies. Even when you talk about unemployment insurance, it just if there was already a system set up with our Department of Labor at the time COVID hit, then there would be less opportunity for fraud. Just verifying you are who you say you are. We already exchange information in a similar way, not including biometrics, but with the Secretary of State, just for voting purposes. I mean, because we're mandated. Every DMV is mandated to do that through the federal law, and so there's already sort of a system in place, and we could improve that system by doing more collaboration with more agencies. Even starting with government, and then when you bring in private banking would have one place to go to verify. I mean, and that's honestly where MDL is headed. There was talk in the white paper about remote provisioning and remote authentication, prioritizing that over in person in the MDL presentment, and so MDL is headed that way. So I think just with more collaboration with, as far as from a DMV perspective, more collaboration, just starting within state government.
Tori, how about you?
Yeah, so I agree with all that's been said, and I think Debbie mentioned it earlier. That there has to be a process for authenticating and then authorization, right? And it's really the same process for states too, just like banks. And I've had some conversations with some financial institutions about their process, and it really the states can learn a lot from collaborating with private industry as well as internal with our agencies. I mean, we're going through a process where our agencies across the state government are going to look at use cases and determine, what they need in terms of authentication. But really, our role as a Department of Information Technology, we see it as being the authenticator and then allow the agencies to be the authorizers for certain benefits. That's not much different than businesses utilizing the state's infrastructure to be the authenticator, and then they will be responsible for the authorization. So, yeah.
I'm going to close into a question. I want to be able to take one question from the audience. I know Jeremy's been earnestly answering some of the questions in the chat, but actually, Tori, I think this flows well into a question from Bob Pinheiro, who asks, since mobile driver's licenses are only now being rolled out for presumably in-person uses, do states view it as important for MDLs to also be used for online purposes?
And that's what we're trying to work through with the digital identity work group that's kicking off here in the state of North Carolina tomorrow. We recognize that we recognize the in-person use of that. And what we're interested in is also making sure that we have a platform so that online use or virtual authentication can take place as well. And the point of our conversations is to make sure that we understand how all of that merges together, because not only is there a mobile driver's license that you can have in your digital wallet, but there's also, fishing license, hunting license, and things like that can go on top of that platform. So, yes.
And Debbie, do you see maybe this is already happening, but do you see a way for, could a mobile driver's license be used as the authentication document to, open an account, to, be,
Very much so. Right now, we have processes where people can take pictures, if you will, of their driver's license through a secure exchange. There's too much friction with that to be and for all the right reasons. We don't keep the driver's license, but we do in some instances require that people upload it, and it's just it's a really clunky process. And to be able to do sort of a mobile exchange to be able to validate that, and then as Jeremy also mentioned, being able to not necessarily have more information than we need. I don't need to know whether you're an organ donor. I don't need to know, in your exact date of birth. I just need to know that you're old enough to have access to certain products. And so in doing so, we dramatically do what, if you're a practitioner in my seat, we reduce sort of the attack surface. As I mentioned, like I don't want to have to protect data that I don't actually in fact need to be able to grant you access to the banking rails. When I get that, if I have it, I'm required by law and believe in doing this, even if it wasn't required by law, to safeguard that data. That costs a lot of money to do for a lot of really good reasons. I'd rather not have it to have to safeguard. Again, this creates these honeypots. So the MDL promise, if you will, or where we're headed is huge for me, relative to both being able to, prove you are who you say you are, both at the account opening process, and then use that again with the transactional process. But it really reduces, again, what data I have to gather on people, and really increases the privacy protocols relative to what every, I think, American should be protecting in terms of their critical data. Mobile driver's license being one of them. And then the primary channels for what we call account recovery, your email channels, as well as your cell phone, those should be your most highly protected accounts in your life, right? If you click, I forgot my password, and it goes, oh, well, we're just going to send it to your email account, but it's your Gmail account that you leave wide open to your friends and family, might not be the wisest idea. So mobile driver's licenses, and then making sure that recovery process has got some strength in it as well is important. Mobile driver's license will play a key role in account recovery as we move forward and as it strengthens its capabilities.
Angelique, I'll give you the last word.
Oh yeah, this is timely because I just returned just yesterday, a day late, from a 10-day trip to Australia, and it was a policy discussion about the interoperability of MDLs, and also what's next. And online presentment is what's next. So there are already ISO standards for the in-person presentment and provisioning, and the working group, it's the international working group that's working on the international standards for online presentment and how that would work, how to protect that, because of course, what does that do? That opens many doors. So what you have now are a lot of states doing pilot trial runs with TSA, because that's sort of a small group, right? And then it will definitely naturally expand to other in-person presentment. But then once you have online presentment, that really, and I would imagine for banking and for financial institutions, that it's really a plus, because that way you can authenticate people and you don't have to have people sending you copies of a driver's license. And that's how we've seen a lot of fraud. Our fraud investigators have seen a lot of fraud with that type of presentment and opening accounts online through just sending in a copy of a driver's license that maybe you made at home that looks pretty good, And so with the actual verification that the MDL will be doing, whether it's online or in person, that is key. Debbie mentioned that. Debbie mentioned data minimization. You don't want, only releasing the information that is necessary for that transaction, for that particular type of transaction. So I'm excited about just coming back from that trip and just seeing people from, all over the world wanting this to work and be interoperable, so that it's not just some toy that's on your phone and that's cute to show to the TSA agent, but, what else can you use that for? What are the real uses for that MDL? So that is coming, but they're still working on the ISO standards for online presentment. So in person will be launched first, and then that will come next. And I can see probably some in-between stages, with just with, for instance, our online accounts, you have to have a password. There is multi-factor authentication. We rolled that out in 2021 for our online accounts and managing your account. But another thing we do is we really push to our customers to know what's on your account, look at those notifications, claim your account, and protect the information that is in your account. And that's one thing I'd liked from the banking industry. The account, I know when I opened an account for my teenager a couple years ago, okay, now this is your online account. You can use it if you like, but basically it's already claimed for her. And she was in person, and that was claimed in person. So that is one thing I like from the banking industry that we want to move to, is creating that in person. So we know for sure that this was the person that should have created this account, because that will cut down on a lot of fraud as well.
Yeah, well, it sounds like there's a lot of important, exciting work to come. I think that's about time. It's a little bit after 2. So I think it's about time to wrap it up. But thank you again to Tori Jessup, Angelique McClendon, and Debbie Guild. And thank you again, Jeremy, for convening this, and the rest of the Better Identity Coalition. It's the blueprint, a really fascinating document. And it sounds like we're going to be hearing a lot about what's in here, and we'll probably be seeing it from a lot of the states in the near future.
Great. Well, thank you, Ben, Debbie, Tori, Angelique, as well. Thanks for joining us today. Glad we could run a few minutes over. I know there was a lot to talk about. We tried to answer some of the Q&A in the chat. Probably didn't get all of them, but feel free to reach out to us individually. We'll also be posting the slides from this event and a video of it sometime shortly. So thanks, everybody, for your interest and support, and look forward to working with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.